On the morning of February 14, 1983, in a labor camp 17 kilometers north of Magadan, a guard discovered something that should have been impossible. Prisoner 4471 was gone. His bed was intact. His boots were still beneath the wooden frame. The morning count had been correct at 5 a.m., but when the work detail assembled at the gates 2 hours later, Viktor Grigorovich Volkov, convicted spy, Article 64, 20 years hard labor, had vanished into air so cold it burned the lungs like acid. The temperature that morning was minus 42 degrees Celsius. No one escapes Siberia in winter. No one even tries. The camp commandant, Major Yuri Petrov, stood in the empty barracks holding Volkov's wool hat. It was still warm. Outside, the taiga stretched in every direction like a frozen ocean, white, endless, and absolutely lethal. Petrov had served at Kolyma camps for 11 years. He had seen men try to run in summer when the ground thawed and the mosquitoes came in clouds thick enough to suffocate a dog. Every single one had been brought back within 72 hours, frostbitten or dead. But in February, in the heart of the Siberian winter, escape wasn't just unlikely. It was suicide. Petrov crushed the hat in his fist and walked to the administration building. He would have to call Moscow. He would have to explain how a 53-year-old political prisoner, a man who hadn't caused trouble in 10 years, who worked quietly in the carpentry shop and ate his thin soup without complaint, had simply disappeared. And he would have to explain why. Because in the pocket of Volkov's coat, which hung on its hook like a shed skin, they found a letter. It was addressed to no one, but it said everything. The Cold War was never fought with armies facing each other across open fields. It was fought in shadows, in the static of intercepted radio signals, in the silent rage of men who believed they were protecting their people by destroying others. It was fought in rooms where decisions were made by men who would never see the consequences, and in frozen camps where those consequences lived and died in silence. By 1983, the Soviet Union and the United States had been locked in this war for 36 years. The world had been divided at Yalta, split at Potsdam, and sealed shut in Berlin. Two empires, two ideologies, two versions of truth, each convinced the other was preparing to strike first. And between them, millions of people who wanted nothing more than to live. The gulags were not a Cold War invention. They had existed since Stalin, sprawling across the Soviet wilderness like a nation within a nation. By the 1980s, the worst of the purges were over. The death camps of Kolyma had been softened, renamed, reclassified, but the system remained. And it still consumed people. Political prisoners, dissidents, refuseniks, people who had signed the wrong petition, spoken to the wrong journalist, or simply been in the wrong place when the KGB needed someone to blame. Article 58 and Article 64, anti-Soviet activity and treason, were vague enough to catch anyone. Viktor Volkov had been caught in 1973. He was an engineer, a good one. He had worked for a state aviation research facility near Novosibirsk, designing fuel systems for MiG fighters. He had a wife, Anna, and two daughters, Katya and Irina. He lived in a small apartment with a view of the river. He grew tomatoes on his balcony. He read Pushkin to his girls before bed. He had never been political. He had never wanted to be. But in 1972, a colleague named Dmitry Volkov had been arrested for passing technical documents to a British intelligence contact in Leningrad. The man's last name was pure coincidence. They were not related. But the KGB does not believe in coincidences. Viktor was questioned. His apartment was searched. His correspondence was read. And in one letter to a friend in Kiev, he had written a single careless sentence. "Sometimes I wonder if we are building the future, or just better ways to destroy it." It was enough. At his trial, Viktor stood in a wood-paneled courtroom and listened as a prosecutor he had never met described him as a traitor. A state-appointed lawyer advised him to confess. The judge barely looked at him. The sentence was 20 years. Article 64. Espionage. Anna had been in the courtroom. She did not cry. She stood when they led him away, and their eyes met for 3 seconds before the guards pushed him through the door. That was the last time Victor saw his family. For 10 years. Kolyma was known as the land of white death. It was a place where winter lasted 9 months, and summer was a brief, wet nightmare of mud and insects. The camps were scattered across thousands of square kilometers, timber operations, mining sites, construction details. The prisoners were called zeks, a term that had lost any human meaning decades ago. They were units of labor, nothing more. Victor arrived in March of 1973 along with 40 other men, on a cargo plane that landed on a dirt strip carved into the forest. The cold hit him like a wall. He had been raised in Siberia, in Tomsk, so he knew winter, but this was different. This was cold that wanted to kill you. The camp was called Susamen 7. It was a timber operation. The prisoners cut trees, hauled logs, and worked in the sawmill. The barracks were long wooden structures with tin roofs and iron stoves that barely worked. The food was cabbage soup, black bread, and porridge made from grain so coarse it scraped your throat going down. Men died in their sleep. They died from the cold, from hunger, from pneumonia, from the kind of exhaustion that simply stops the heart. Some mornings, the guards would walk through the barracks and find 2 or 3 bodies stiff in their bunks, eyes still open. They were buried in unmarked graves behind the camp. Victor learned quickly. He learned not to speak unless spoken to. He learned to keep his head down, to eat slowly, to save every scrap of energy. He learned that in the gulag, survival was not about strength, it was about invisibility. He worked in the carpentry shop, repairing tools and building crates for equipment. The work was cold, but it was indoors, which made it better than the forest. He did not complain. He did not cause trouble. He became what the system wanted him to be, a ghost. But at night, when the stove burned low and the other men snored in the darkness, Victor would lie on his back and think about Anna. He thought about her hair, the way it fell across her face when she leaned over the stove. He thought about Katya's laugh, bright and sudden like a bell. He thought about Irina, who had been only 6 when he was taken, who had cried so hard the day of his arrest that she vomited on the kitchen floor. He wondered if they remembered him. He wondered if they thought he was still alive. For the first 3 years he received letters. They came irregularly, sometimes 2 in a month, sometimes none for half a year. They were censored, entire lines blacked out by a bureaucrat in Moscow who decided what a prisoner was allowed to know. But even in fragments, the letters were everything. Anna wrote about the girls, about school, about the small apartment they had moved to after Victor's arrest, something cheaper, farther from the center. She wrote about her job at the textile factory. She wrote about the neighbor's cat. She wrote about nothing because nothing was all she was allowed to say. But between the lines, Victor could read the truth. She was alone. She was struggling. And she was waiting. Then, in 1976, the letters stopped. Victor wrote to her every month. He filled out the regulation forms, wrote his careful sentences, and handed them to the camp clerk. But no replies came. He told himself it was the mail. The Soviet postal system was a disaster, especially to and from the camps. Letters were lost, delayed, rerouted, but months became a year, and a year became 2. By 1978, Victor understood. Something had happened. He did not know what, and he could not find out. The camp had no telephone for prisoners. Letters to government offices went unanswered. Requests for information were denied. Victor was cut off. He existed in a place where time had stopped, where the world outside was as distant as the moon. He worked, he ate, he slept, he survived. But part of him had started to die. The part that hoped. In 1982, a new prisoner arrived at Susamen 7. His name was Alexei Turgenev. He was 34 years old, a former history teacher from Sverdlovsk, arrested for possessing samizdat, illegal underground literature. He had been sentenced to 8 years under Article 70, anti-Soviet agitation. Alexei was not built for the camps. He was thin, with soft hands and a scholar's posture. Within 2 weeks, he had frostbite on 3 fingers. Within a month, he had lost 12 kilograms. The other prisoners ignored him. In the gulag, weakness was contagious. But Victor saw something else. He saw a man who was still human. One night after the evening count, Victor sat down beside Alexei in the barracks. The younger man was shivering, wrapped in a blanket that had more holes than fabric. "You need to eat more," Victor said quietly. Alexei looked at him with hollow eyes. "There is nothing more to eat. There is always something. You just have to know where to look." Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of dried fish, something he had traded for with a camp cook. He handed it to Alexei. "Why?" Alexei whispered. Victor did not answer. Over the following weeks, Alexei began to survive. Victor taught him how to wrap his feet in newspaper for insulation, how to drink slowly so the body retained heat, how to move just fast enough to avoid the guard's attention, but not so fast that he burned energy he could not replace. And in return, Alexei gave Victor something he had not had in years: news. Alexei had been arrested recently. He knew what was happening in the world. He knew about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, about Reagan's election in America, about the new General Secretary, Yuri Andropov, who had once run the KGB and was now running the country. And one night, when the wind howled outside and the stove hissed and popped, Alexei told Victor something else. "There is a list," Alexei said quietly. "A list of political prisoners who are being reviewed for early release. It was in the Samizdat papers, before I was arrested. The government is trying to improve relations with the West. They want to look reasonable." Victor stared at the ceiling. "I am not on any list. How do you know?" "Because I am a spy. Article 64. They do not release spies." Alexei was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have family?" Victor closed his eyes. "I had a wife, 2 daughters. I have not heard from them in 6 years. Alexei looked at him in the darkness. "Then you need to find out." Victor wrote letters. He wrote to the camp administration, requesting information about his family. He wrote to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He wrote to the Red Cross. Every letter was formal, careful, stripped of emotion. He received no answers. In the gulag, silence was the default response to everything. But Victor kept writing. And then in January of 1983, something changed. A new clerk arrived at the camp, a young woman named Lydia, transferred from a regional office in Magadan. She was 26, with tired eyes and a bureaucrat's efficiency. She processed paperwork without comment, stamped forms without looking up, and kept the camp's files in perfect order. But one afternoon, Victor noticed something. She had been crying. It was barely visible, a redness around her eyes, a tightness in her jaw. But Victor had lived among broken people for 10 years. He knew grief when he saw it. A week later, Victor approached her desk with a routine request, a replacement for a broken saw blade in the carpentry shop. Lydia processed the form without speaking. As Victor turned to leave, he said quietly, "I hope things get better." Lydia looked up. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she said, "Why would you say that?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone is carrying something heavy." Lydia's face hardened. "You do not know anything about me." "No," Victor said. "I do not. But I know what it is like to lose people you love." He left before she could respond. 2 days later, Lydia called him back to the administration building. She handed him a file. "I should not be doing this," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "If anyone finds out, I will be dismissed, maybe worse." Victor opened the file. Inside was a single document. A record from the Ministry of Health in Novosibirsk, Anna Volkova. Admitted to Regional Hospital, No. 3, December 1982. Diagnosis, Stage 4 lung cancer. Prognosis, terminal. Victor's hands began to shake. "She is dying," Lydia said quietly. "She has maybe 2 months, maybe less. Victor could not speak. Lydia leaned forward. Her voice was barely a whisper. My brother died in a camp like this. He was 23. They would not let my mother see him before he died. She never forgave herself. She closed the file. I cannot help you, but I will not stop you. Victor looked at her. What are you saying? Lydia stood. She walked to the door and paused. The night shift guard on the north perimeter is lazy. He smokes in the watchtower and does not watch the fence. The weak point is near the drainage ditch, where the wire was repaired last summer. It is not properly secured. She opened the door. That is all I know, and she left. Victor sat alone in the empty office, staring at the file. Anna was dying. His wife was dying, and he was 1,700 kilometers away, locked in a frozen cage. He had 10 years left on his sentence. He would never see her again, unless Victor spent the next 3 weeks preparing. He did not tell anyone, not even Alexei. In the Gulag, trust was a luxury that could kill you. He collected materials slowly, carefully. A piece of wire from the carpentry shop. A tin can that he flattened and sharpened into a blade. A pair of wool socks stolen from the supply room. A small jar of rendered fat, traded for with a kitchen worker. He studied the guard rotations. He watched the perimeter at night, memorizing the patterns. He learned which prisoners snored, which ones woke at the slightest sound. He prepared himself to die, because Victor understood the reality. Escaping the camp was possible. Surviving the taiga was not. The nearest town, Susaman, was 40 kilometers south. The railway was 70 kilometers west. There were no roads, no villages. Nothing but forest and frozen rivers and cold that would kill a man in hours. Victor had no map, no compass, no supplies beyond what he could carry in his pockets. But he also had no choice. Anna was dying. And Victor had spent 10 years in a place where death was so common it had become boring. He had watched men collapse in the snow. He had watched them cough blood into their hands. He had watched them hang themselves from the rafters with braided bedsheets. He had survived because he had something to survive for. But if Anna died without him, if she died alone, thinking he had forgotten her, then survival meant nothing. So Victor made a decision. He would walk out of the camp. He would walk south. And he would keep walking until he reached her, or until the cold took him. Either way, he would be free. On the night of February 13th, 1983, Victor lay in his bunk and waited. The barracks were dark, 50 men breathing in the cold. The stove had burned down to embers. Outside, the wind screamed. Victor waited until 2 a.m., then he stood. He moved slowly, carefully, placing each foot with absolute precision. He had practiced this for weeks. How to walk without sound. How to shift his weight without creaking the floorboards. He reached the door. It was not locked. The camp relied on the taiga to keep prisoners inside, not doors. Victor stepped into the night. The cold hit him like a fist. -42 degrees. The kind of cold that stops time. Victor pulled his coat tight and walked toward the north fence. The camp was silent except for the wind. Victor moved along the edge of the barracks, staying in the shadows. The snow beneath his boots squeaked with each step, a sound that carried in the frozen air like a gunshot. He forced himself to move slowly. Panic was death. Haste was death. Patience was survival. The north perimeter was 200 meters away. Between him and the fence were 3 open spaces: the latrines, the vehicle yard, and the assembly ground. All of them were lit by floodlights mounted on wooden poles, their beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Victor watched the watchtower. The guard was there, a dark shape behind the glass. Lydia had been right. He was smoking. Victor could see the orange glow of the cigarette, moving from hand to mouth and back again. The guard was not watching the fence. He was watching nothing. Victor counted to 60. Then he moved. He crossed the first open space in 8 seconds, reaching the shadow of the latrine building. He pressed himself against the wall and waited. His heart was hammering. His breath came in white clouds that hung in the air. No alarm, no shout. He crossed the vehicle yard next, moving between two trucks with canvas covers stiff as iron, then the assembly ground, where prisoners stood each morning to be counted like livestock. And then he was at the fence. The wire was 3 meters high, topped with barbed coils. But Lydia had been right. Near the drainage ditch, where melting snow had pooled and refrozen, the repair work was sloppy. 2 of the vertical posts were loose. The wire sagged. Victor pulled the tin blade from his pocket and began to cut. The wire was old, brittle from the cold. It snapped with small pinging sounds that made him freeze each time. He worked for 10 minutes, cutting a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. He looked back at the camp one last time. The barracks where he had slept for 10 years. The carpentry shop where he had kept himself sane by working with his hands. The administration building where his file sat in a cabinet, marked with a red stamp, political, Article 64, dangerous. He thought of Alexei, asleep in his bunk. He thought of Lydia, who had risked everything to give him a chance. Then Viktor Volkov crawled through the fence and disappeared into the taiga. The forest swallowed him whole. Within 20 meters of the camp, the floodlights were gone. There was only darkness and the pale glow of snow under a starless sky. The trees were black columns, close together, their branches heavy with ice. Victor oriented himself south by memory. The camp faced north. The road to Susuman lay behind it. He began to walk. The cold was unimaginable. It was not the cold of a winter morning or a frozen lake. It was the cold of the void, the cold of extinction. It pressed against his face like a hand. It burned his lungs with every breath. Within minutes, his fingers were numb inside his gloves. Within an hour, he could no longer feel his feet, but he kept walking. He moved carefully, testing the snow before putting his weight down. There were hidden streams under the ice, crevasses between rocks, places where the snow was soft and deep enough to trap a man. He rationed his energy the way he had rationed food for 10 years. Every step was calculated. Every breath was deliberate. He walked for 3 hours before he allowed himself to rest. He found a fallen tree, its trunk thick enough to block the wind, and crouched behind it. He pulled out the jar of rendered fat and forced himself to eat a small amount. It was rancid and thick, like swallowing grease, but it was calories. It was fuel. He checked his hands. They were white at the fingertips. Frostbite was beginning. Victor rubbed them together, forcing circulation. Pain was good. Pain meant the tissue was still alive. He allowed himself 3 minutes of rest. Then he stood and kept walking. By dawn, Victor had covered perhaps 12 kilometers. The sun did not rise so much as the darkness faded into gray. The forest looked the same in every direction. Endless, indifferent, ancient. There were no landmarks, no trails, just trees and snow and the white silence that made Victor feel like the last man alive. He knew the camp would have discovered his absence by now. The morning count would have come up short. Major Petrov would have called a search. Dogs would be brought in. Guards would sweep the perimeter. But Victor also knew they would not pursue him far. In summer, yes, in summer, they would hunt him for days. But in February, the taiga was a death sentence. The camp would report the escape to Moscow, file the paperwork, and mark him as deceased. No one survives -40 in the Siberian wilderness. No one even tries. But Victor was not trying to survive. He was trying to reach Anna. And that was different. The hallucinations began on the second day. Victor knew what they were. He had seen it before in the camps. Men who had worked too long in the cold, whose minds had started to fracture from exhaustion and hypothermia. They would see things that were not there, hear voices, speak to people who had been dead for years. Victor saw his daughters. Katya appeared first, walking beside him through the trees. She was 16, the age she had been when he was arrested. She wore her blue winter coat and her hair was braided the way Anna used to braid it. "Papa," she said, "you need to rest." Victor did not answer. He knew she was not real. But she kept walking beside him, her breath white in the cold. "You are going to die out here," Katya said. Her voice was soft, sad. "You know that, don't you?" Yes, Victor whispered. Then why are you doing this? Victor stopped walking. He looked at the ghost of his daughter. Because your mother should not die alone. Katja smiled. It was the saddest smile Victor had ever seen. She is not alone, Papa. We are with her. Then she was gone. Victor stood in the forest, tears freezing on his face. He kept walking. On the third day, Victor found a road. It was not much, a logging track barely visible under the snow, but it was a road. It meant people, it meant civilization, it also meant danger. Roads meant checkpoints. Roads meant police. Roads meant questions he could not answer without a propus, an internal passport that would immediately identify him as an escaped prisoner. But Victor no longer cared about danger. His feet were black with frostbite. His face was covered in sores where the cold had burned through his skin. He had not eaten in 36 hours. He had not slept in 3 days. He was dying, and he knew it. He followed the road south. After 2 hours, he saw smoke. A small village, maybe a dozen houses, clustered around a central square. There were lights in some of the windows. A dog barked in the distance. Victor stood at the edge of the village and tried to think. He could not go into the village. They would see him for what he was, a Zek, a camp prisoner, a fugitive. They would call the police. They would send him back. But he also could not keep walking. His body was shutting down. He could feel it, the sluggish heartbeat, the dimming vision, the creeping numbness that was not cold anymore but simply absence. He needed help, or he needed to die trying. Victor walked into the village. The first person who saw him was a woman hanging laundry on a line behind her house. She was old, 70 at least, her face carved into deep lines by decades of Siberian winters. She looked up and saw Victor standing in the snow, swaying on his feet, his coat crusted with ice. For a long moment she just stared. Then she said, "You're from the camp." It was not a question. Victor nodded. The woman looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and walked into her house. Victor stood alone in the yard, waiting for the sound of a telephone, the arrival of police, the end. But instead, the woman came back out. She was carrying a bowl of soup. She handed it to Victor. "Eat," she said. Quickly. Victor's hand shook as he raised the bowl to his lips. The soup was thin, mostly water and cabbage, but it was hot. It burned his throat going down. The woman watched him drink. "What is your name?" she asked. "Victor. Where are you going?" "Novosibirsk." The woman's eyes widened. "That is over 1,000 kilometers from here." "Yes. You will not make it. I know." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "My son was in the camps. He died there. They never told me why. They never told me where he was buried." She reached into her coat and pulled out a wool scarf. "Take this." Victor tried to speak, but his voice broke. The woman pressed the scarf into his hands. "Go," she said, "before someone sees you." Victor wrapped the scarf around his neck. It still smelled like wood smoke and soap. "Thank you," he whispered. The woman did not respond. She turned and walked back into her house, closing the door behind her. Victor stood in the yard for one more moment. Then he walked back into the forest. The scarf saved his life. Not because it kept him warm, nothing could keep him warm anymore, but because it reminded him that he was not alone. That somewhere in this frozen wasteland, there were still people who understood what it meant to lose someone. People who believed that love was worth dying for. Victor walked for 2 more days. He no longer knew where he was. The road had disappeared. The forest had become a maze. He followed the sun when it appeared, and when it did not, he followed nothing. He fell 7 times. Each time, it took longer to stand up. On the 5th night, Victor collapsed beside a frozen stream. He could not feel his legs. His hands were black and swollen. His breath came in shallow gasps that sounded like tearing paper. He lay on his back and looked at the stars. They were the same stars he had looked at from the camp. The same stars he had looked at from his balcony in Novosibirsk, standing beside Anna while the girls slept inside. Victor thought about his wife. He thought about the way she had stood in the courtroom, silent and strong, refusing to cry even as they took him away. He thought about her letters, the careful words that said so little and meant so much. He thought about the last thing she had written, 3 years before the letters stopped. "We are still here, Victor. We are still waiting." Victor closed his eyes. "I am sorry," he whispered to the stars. "I tried." And then he heard something. A sound. Not the wind, not an animal. A voice. "Papa." Victor opened his eyes. Irina was standing beside him. She was 13 now, older than Victor had ever seen her. She looked like Anna, the same dark eyes, the same serious expression. "You have to get up," Irina said. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." Victor shook his head. "I am too tired." Irina knelt beside him. She reached out and touched his face. Her hand was warm. "Mama is waiting," she said. Victor began to cry. "I will not make it." "You will," Irina said. "Because you are the strongest man I know." She stood and held out her hand. "Get up, Papa." Victor looked at her hand. He knew she was not real. He knew his mind was breaking, that hypothermia and exhaustion were creating phantoms to comfort him as he died. But he also knew that Irina was right. Anna was waiting. And Victor had not walked 5 days through hell to give up now. He reached up and took his daughter's hand. And he stood. Victor did not remember the next 2 days. Later, when doctors asked him to describe what happened, he could only recall fragments. Walking through a village at night, climbing onto a truck, voices, darkness, the smell of diesel fuel and cigarettes. He woke up in a hospital, not in Siberia, not in a camp infirmary, in Novosibirsk. He was in a bed with white sheets. There were tubes in his arms. A nurse was standing beside him checking a chart. When she saw his eyes open, she froze. "You are awake," she said. Victor tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The nurse poured water into a cup and held it to his lips. "How?" Victor whispered. "How did I get here?" "A truck driver found you collapsed on the side of the road near Tinda. He thought you were dead. He brought you to the local hospital, and they transferred you here 3 days ago." Victor closed his eyes. Tinda was 800 kilometers from Susamen. He had walked 800 kilometers. He did not know how. "Where?" Victor's voice cracked. "Where is Anna Volkova?" The nurse looked uncomfortable. "I do not know that name. She is a patient here. Lung cancer. Stage 4. Please." The nurse hesitated. Then she said, "I will ask." She left the room. Victor lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling. His hands were wrapped in bandages. He could not feel his feet. His face was covered in dressings. But he was alive. And he was in Novosibirsk. The nurse returned 10 minutes later. She was not alone. Behind her was a doctor, an older man with gray hair and a tired face. "Mr. Volkov," the doctor said. "I need to ask you some questions. Where is my wife?" The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse. "Your wife is in the oncology ward. She is very ill. I need to see her. That is not possible right now." Victor tried to sit up, but his body would not respond. "You do not understand," he said. "I walked here. I walked from Kolyma. I have to see her." The doctor's expression changed. "You walked from Kolyma?" "Yes. That is over 1,500 kilometers." "I know." The doctor stared at him. "Mr. Volkov, I need to inform you that your status is ... complicated. You are listed as an escaped prisoner. The authorities have been notified. There will be officers here soon." Victor looked at him. "I do not care about the authorities. I care about my wife. Please, let me see her." The doctor was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I will give you 1 hour. That is all I can do." They brought Victor to the oncology ward in a wheelchair. His hands were bandaged. His feet were bandaged. His face was covered in gauze. But he was sitting up. He was breathing. He was alive. The nurse pushed him down a long hallway with green walls and fluorescent lights. They passed rooms with open doors, where patients lay in beds, some sleeping, some staring at nothing. They stopped at room 347. "She does not know you are here," the nurse said quietly. "She does not know you are alive." Victor nodded. The nurse opened the door. Anna was lying in a bed by the window. She was thin, so thin that Victor could see the shape of her bones beneath her skin. Her hair was gray now, cut short. There were tubes in her arms and an oxygen mask over her face. But it was her. It was Anna. Victor tried to speak, but no sound came out. The nurse wheeled him to the bedside. "Anna," she said softly, "you have a visitor." Anna's eyes opened slowly. She looked at the nurse. Then she looked at Victor. For a long moment she did not recognize him. Victor was almost unrecognizable, his face swollen and scarred, his eyes hollow, his body broken. But then something changed in Anna's expression. Her eyes widened. Her hand moved, slowly, reaching toward him. "Victor?" she whispered. Victor took her hand. "Yes," he said. "It is me." Anna began to cry. They were not loud sobs, just tears streaming down her face, silent and endless. "How?" she whispered. "How are you here?" "I walked." Anna stared at him. "You walked?" "Yes." "From the camp?" Victor nodded. Anna closed her eyes. Her hand tightened around his. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "You should not have risked your life. I had to see you. Why?" Victor looked at his wife. The woman he had loved for 30 years. The woman who had waited for him while the world fell apart. The woman who had raised their daughters alone, who had worked and struggled and survived. Even as the state punished her for being the wife of a traitor. "Because you should not die alone," Victor said. Anna opened her eyes. She looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, weak and sad and beautiful. "I am not alone," she said. "I have you." Victor leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. They stayed like that, holding each other, while the winter sun came through the window and filled the room with pale light. Outside, in the hallway, the nurse stood by the door. She could hear them talking quietly, their voices too low to make out the words. She checked her watch. 58 minutes left. The police arrived at the hospital 2 hours later. They came in uniform, 3 officers and a plainclothes KGB agent in a gray coat. They walked through the oncology ward with heavy boots and grim faces, looking for the escaped prisoner. But when they reached room 347, the doctor stopped them. "He is with his wife," the doctor said. "We have orders to take him into custody," the KGB agent said. "She is dying." "That is unfortunate, but irrelevant." The doctor looked at the agent. "If you take him now, she will die alone." "Is that what you want?" The agent's face was stone. "What I want does not matter. He is a fugitive. Article 64. He must be returned to custody." The doctor stepped forward. "Then you will have to go through me." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the officers, a young man with a round face, said quietly, "Comrade, perhaps we could wait. Just a few hours." "Until?" "No," the agent snapped. "We follow orders." He pushed past the doctor and opened the door to room 347. Inside, Victor was sitting beside Anna's bed, holding her hand. They were not speaking. They were just sitting together, watching the light fade outside the window. The agent stopped in the doorway. He looked at the old man in bandages, holding the hand of the dying woman. He looked at the forestand, the oxygen mask, the monitor that beeped softly with Anna's heartbeat. For 10 seconds, the agent stood frozen. Then he turned and walked out of the room. "We will wait," he said to the officers. "Until morning." The doctor stared at him in disbelief. "Why?" The agent did not answer. He walked down the hallway and out of the ward without looking back. The young officer watched him go. Then he looked at the doctor. "He had a wife," the officer said quietly. "She died in a hospital. He was on duty. He did not make it in time." The doctor nodded slowly. "I understand." The officers took up positions in the hallway. And inside room 347, Victor and Anna sat together through the night. Anna died at dawn. It was quiet, painless. She simply stopped breathing, her hand still wrapped around Victor's. Victor sat with her for a long time after. He did not cry. He had no tears left. He just held her hand and listened to the silence. When the nurse came in to check on them, she saw Victor sitting motionless beside the bed. "Mr. Volkov," she said gently. "I am sorry." Victor nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me be here." The nurse's eyes filled with tears. "You walked 1,500 kilometers to see her," she said. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Victor looked at his wife's face. She looked peaceful now. The pain was gone. The struggle was over. It was worth it, Victor said. The officers took Victor into custody an hour later. They were not rough. They helped him into the wheelchair, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and wheeled him out of the hospital in silence. The KGB agent was waiting by the car. He looked at Victor for a long moment. Then he said, "You are going back to the camp. Your sentence will be extended for the escape. You will likely die there." Victor nodded. "I know." The agent opened the car door. "Was it worth it?" Victor looked back at the hospital. "Yes," he said. "It was worth everything." The agent stared at him. Then he closed the door. Viktor Grigorovich Volkov was returned to Susamin 7 on March 3, 1983. His sentence was extended by 5 years for the escape. He was placed in isolation for 6 months. His hands and feet, destroyed by frostbite, required partial amputation, but he survived. He survived another 7 years in the camps, working in the carpentry shop, eating thin soup, and sleeping in a wooden barracks where the cold never stopped. He was released in 1990, 1 year before the Soviet Union collapsed. He returned to Novosibirsk and lived in a small apartment near the river. He visited Anna's grave every Sunday. He grew tomatoes on his balcony. He read Pushkin in the evenings. His daughters came to see him. Katya, now a doctor in Moscow. Irina, a teacher in Tomsk. They brought their children, Victor's grandchildren, and told them about the man who had walked across Siberia to see his wife one last time. Victor lived until 2003. He was 73 years old. When he died, they buried him beside Anna. On his headstone, someone, no one knows who, carved a single line: "He walked home." The Cold War ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the red flag came down from the Kremlin. But for millions of people, the war had never been about flags or ideology. It had been about survival, about holding on to humanity in a world that wanted to erase it, about loving someone even when the cost was your life. Viktor Volkov's story became a legend among the camps. The prisoner who escaped Siberia in winter, the man who walked 1,500 kilometers to see his dying wife. No official record of his escape exists. The KGB destroyed the file in 1991, along with thousands of others. But the story survived, because some stories are too powerful to erase. They live in the memories of nurses who let a man see his wife, in the hearts of truck drivers who stop for strangers on frozen roads, in the quiet courage of old women who give scarves to fugitives because they remember their own sons lost to the same cruel machine. The Cold War was fought by governments and won by no one, but it was survived by people like Victor, people who believed that love was stronger than fear, that family was worth more than ideology, that walking home, no matter the cost, was always the right choice. If stories like this make you reflect on the cost of political systems that grind human beings into statistics, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Stories of ordinary people who defied the impossible, not for glory, but for love. Because in the end, when everything else falls away, the borders, the regimes, the wars, love is the only thing worth dying for. And sometimes, the only thing worth living for.